If I use the words romantic, romanticism or romance today, most people think in the first instance of something like love and being with someone you adore, or flowers and dinners, or whatever. That means a strong attraction between two people. Some of you might know that the central word romance has a long history, or can imagine that surely romance must have been similar in some way centuries ago, because surely romance has always been around. These ideas are broadly true, but in this lecture pod we are going to look at romanticism in a more advanced sense. A sense that goes way beyond these ordinary meanings about love and attraction. Romanticism is the name of a broad cultural movement which began already while the Enlightenment was underway in the 18th century. So let's say some of the earlier signs were coming from the 1770s and then continued on into the 19th century. Perhaps most famously with the British Romantic poets of the early 19th, and that was so strong and important that its cultural effects are still felt today in deeper ways than just our thinking about gifts of flowers or dinners under a sunset. In fact, we will focus on romanticism as something of a revolution in early modernity, and we're often thinking of it as participating in contrasting moves with Enlightenment ideas and attitudes. Romantics altered and opposed some of the key Enlightenment attitudes that we have covered in recent lectures. The contrast and opposition was complex and involved some early concerns about modern city life and what it was doing to people, and then a focus on emotions rather than reason, and some important shifts in thinking about art, expression, and the qualities of life necessary for people to thrive rather than just the importance of progress. One of the most important early romantic figures was Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and we read him at this stage of the course because he wrote a memoir looking back on some of his experiences away from the city and turning in on some of his self, turning to his feelings and his imagination as something that was enjoyable. For many romantics, Rousseau, his text, was an early sign of their own thinking, and we're going to discuss that in more detail soon. So first I'm going to do some very basic history of the term romance in order to set up what happened in the 18th century as a counter-movement away from Enlightenment. Then I will discuss some themes that are important to understanding romanticism in a general sense, providing some links to today. In the same way that we can say the Enlightenment project continues today, we can also say that romanticism has not stopped influencing modern culture. Let's start with the etymology of the word, the history of the word. Romantic, romance, romance, roman, roman, Rome. We know that the history of the word takes us back to the lasting influence of the Romans through medieval times, across 500 CE to 1500 CE. What we mean by that is that Roman influenced language and culture for many hundreds of years, providing Latin and the structures of Christianity centered on Rome. Medieval romances were long poems about knights, quests, chivalry, fair maidens, idealized love, magic, and even monsters. They reflected the culture of strongly Christianized nobles, and love was something that should be pure in the mind, and often, in fact, unrealized, at least when it was read about or put into song. Note that these early romances were not always about love. That is a far more modern focus with the use of the word, though love was certainly part of many medieval romances. Romances were handwritten and already considered old when the printing press was invented in the 15th century. By the early 1700s, romance meant those old tales, which were full of fanciful scenes and sentiments that were old-fashioned and outdated. Society had changed, and many different types of stories were now printed. Old tales about quests and fighting dragons were considered quaint concerns of another time. So the sense of romance for modernity began with some early negative connotations about back then, something old and pre-modern. To be romantic in England in the early 1700s was to be thought somewhat uncultivated, not schooled well, not up to date. But then the term began to be culturally revived and used in a more positive way as something in opposition to the contemporary Enlightenment values and concerns. And the key shift seems to have been a lot to do with an emerging appreciation of nature. The romantic landscape was to be appreciated because it offered something that was outside the growing cities of Europe and was an experience of natural beauty, of created beauty that had not been damaged or overrun by human social life. The first and strongest of romantic themes is simply that of nature, given to human experience as a good in itself. We can probably simply understand this shift as happening as cities were growing, along with an awareness that human society was not always delivering the best of conditions. Those that could afford to travel began to appreciate the spectacular views of the Alps, the oceans, some of the great forests that still existed then. Debates had already been developing about how to understand the aesthetic qualities of nature. How and why do we experience pleasure at seeing some things in nature? There were already two terms being used, the beautiful, of course, and the sublime. The beautiful was that which was pleasing and soothing to the senses. It suggested the organized and the pleasant, scenes that were comforting and seemed to be easily accessible to the human mind. On the other hand, the sublime was challenging, awe-inspiring, and showed nature as vast and infinite. Looking out over a cliff or experiencing a storm-filled ocean was a different appreciation of nature. Slightly disturbing, shocking, pushing our comfort aside and leaving our reason feeling inadequate to understanding the experience. The sublime could be a dark, foreboding night, but at the same time the thrill of being amongst it. Both these ways of appreciating nature had been written about and came to more prominence as artists, writers and philosophers then started to make important connections with understanding ourselves. Because these experiences were not just about the natural world, but also said something about what human beings are like. And this is our second and closely connected theme in introducing Romanticism in the 18th century, the emotional or feeling self. While it was not that the growing appreciation of nature alone made the early Romantics focus on human emotions, we can see the connection in that some started thinking about the inner nature of humans, what in us is natural, and how is it that the natural world seems to draw out of us something quite deep and not particularly reasonable and ordered. Some early arguments saw in the natural world an infinite creation that seemed to echo the infinite inner depths of the human mind. They confirmed each other. Romantics were also rebels in wanting passionate life and acceptance of emotions to be affirmed at a time when Europe was concerned, as we have seen, with progress, with rational programs of advancing commerce and government. The life of the imagination was essential because the infinite sublime that nature displayed could be felt in our passionate and imaginative moods. The ways in which scientific investigation was uncovering nature's laws and powers was both an inspiration to some romantics because it suggested ways in which human thought could be closer to the world, but also a concern because science was becoming the source of technology, of the emerging machines of modern life that did not seem to respect nature at all. There were philosophers who thought nature was perhaps just a giant material machine, and we were little cogs within it. For the Romantics, this was a poor way to think of our place, for it made our emotional life and inner imagination almost irrelevant. So the third theme that the Romantics were responsible for pursuing in the 18th century was the value of art and creativity. Human life could be creative, they thought, because our expressions often released us from the normal constraints of social life. But not just anyone could do this, and only some could be truly sensitive enough to feel things fully apart from conventions and learned style. The Romantic poet William Wordsworth in the early 19th century felt this was the case and also demanded the poet aim for a sincerity of feeling and expression, showing the world the way it really was and aiming to get true feelings through the medium of language onto the page. This would be Romanticism at its height in the early 19th century, and I hope you can think quickly that even today, when we think of how we enjoy the natural world and what we think it does for us, perhaps why we enjoy sunsets or great cliff views and feel that our emotions are engaged by those experiences, that we still echo faintly this sort of desire for a really sincere connection with the world. Wordsworth also stressed that the individual and his or her experience was a source of real expression and creativity, and in this we see also that romantic thought fitted in with some Enlightenment progressive views that wanted more freedom for individuals and a loosening of tradition. The Romantics were types of individualists in some ways, and many did not engage in the more radical of politics that was beginning to develop across Europe. But did that mean that their turn to nature and emotional life was a rebellion only for individuals thinking of themselves? Not really. But we need to consider a little more some of their thinking about society and what individuals might value differently. I will turn to this in the next lecture, which will then lead into an introduction of Jean-Jacques Rousseau's early writing.